So let's talk about how movement works in the game. We're going to start with land movement, pretty much the most basic of all. Essentially, you can move up to 2 armies through as many friendly territories as you want. So they can be spent or fresh. So what you do, say we wanted to move this army, this could go all the way over through all friendly territories, as far as they want, all the way over to Prussia if you wanted. Since Austria-Hungary and Germany are allied, we could have some Germans come in here and support as well. They could be fresh as well. You could take fresh units and move them. They just have to be through friendly controlled territories, but they can move basically as far as they want. Remember the scale of this game. We're talking each turn is 3 months. We're talking about moving an entire army. So logistically, this is kind of shipping them out to another front in the war is essentially what we're doing there. So that's how movement works. If you want to move into an area that is friendly controlled but doesn't have an army, you still have to attack into it. There is an implied garrison. You cannot just freely move in to take that area. So say Belgium was open here. It probably wouldn't be at the beginning of the game, but for sake of this argument, we'll do that. And if we wanted to move a German unit into here, we'd actually have to attack. And there's a fixed die roll. So in an area like this, um, essentially is a fixed die roll of 2. So anything other than a 1, and you'll be able to move into it on a normal attack. If it is a mountain area that was, say there were the pictures of the mountains here in Belgium. If there was a mountain area and you were wanting to move into there, there was no unit, it would be a fixed die roll of 3. So again, anything other than a 1 or a 2 would win combat. So that's how garrisons work. Other interesting things on land movement, both the USA and Turkey can move 1 independent unit on their turn. So the US activates during the Eastern Allies, and Turkey operates during the Central Allies phase. And what that means essentially, so say the Central Allies are going, you could have 2 Austria-Hungary armies move, and then Turkey could independently move 1 army as well, if they haven't themselves moved 2. If you spend both of those movements on Turkey, they can't move a third. They can kind of do 1 independent. But if you do like 1 Turkey, 1 Austria-Hungary, you can then go back and do a second Turkish army. So that's how those moves work. So that's land movement and how it works. Now let's talk about land combat and how land combat works. Let's our dice out here. Essentially, land combat starts and is relatively simple. You have an area, so say in Hanover, I'm going to have the Germans attack into Belgium. What's going to happen is the Germans are going to pick which army is attacking. It's got to be a fresh army to attack, so they're just going to attack with this top one. They're going to go to spent because they're attacking and they're not attacking a trench into Belgium. But we've got to see what happens. So either side, kind of base combat, is 1 die each. We'll have the brown and blue for the triple entente and the black and red for the central powers in this case. And so both sides would roll. And this is a tie. Tie goes to the attackers. So in this case, the attackers win, and then the defender is flipped to spent. Okay, so now the defender is spent, but the attacker has fresh army still. If they want to choose the attack, the attacker decides they want to choose it, continue the attack. So they're going to use the next army. The same thing would happen. There'd be a re-roll. There's only 1 army left. If there was a second army, say the British were in here, the defender would have to use the fresh army. So defender is always using fresh armies unless there is no more fresh armies. If all the armies are spent, they decide which one is going to defend. In this case, it would be have to be Belgium, the Belgian army, because they're the only spent army there. And we roll. And so there's another victory. It was a 4-1. So again, the defender is spent. And in this case, because they attacked and successfully hit a spent army, that army would then have to retreat into a legal area. So they could go in here and just saw them. Defender, the attacking unit must move in, and then the attacker can choose any other armies that were in that area to move in as well, if they would like, or they don't have to. But the attacking army must advance into after combat. If that happened in an attacking army, they could then launch an attack with remaining fresh armies and keep going. The other piece that we didn't mention is the big push. So let's roll this back before that attack. Put the British here. So how does a big push work? Well, the Germans won the first attack, so they have a marker that says big push. Because they're gathering momentum on their attack, their subsequent rolls are now going to be a +1 to the roll. So then when they roll, they're going to be at a +1. But in this case, they lost. That 3 would be modified with the big push into a 4, but the defender rolled a 6. So if this happened, the big push would go away. It stays as you keep winning, you keep the marker out. It's not cumulative, so you only ever get +1. But if you win 3 times in a row, your second and your third attack are going to have a +1 die roll modifier. In this case, however, the defender wins. Nothing happens to them, but the attacker still goes to spent. Right? And so now the attacker could choose to attack again. The defender doesn't get a big push, only the attacker can get a big push. So that's how the big push marker works, and how retreats work. So let's talk about some other special things. Let's set up a different attack here. Let's go into Verdun. So we're going to reset these guys here. We're going to reset. Okay. So we're attacking into Verdun this time. We got some unique things going on. We have some trenches here. And so we'll talk about trench combat first. So say we were attacking here from the Rhine into Verdun. We've already got a spent army, so he can't be used to attack. So the attacker, they're going to choose a fresh army, one on top here, to attack. Now, before the defender has to choose an army, the attacker has to get through this trench. So same thing as before. Each side's going to roll a die. And we got a 4 to a 2. That is a win. So the trench is breached. The attacker is not spent. So if they get through the trench, they're not necessarily spent, but they still, if they win the combat, but they still have to get through it first. Had they lost, had this been like a 6 to 4, the trench would remain intact, but the defender would go to spent. So you have to basically breach the trenches before you can advance. Regular spaces with no mountains can have 2 trench markers. So if there's 2 trench markers, the attacker has to get through both of those before they can start attacking the actual army units. So very hard to kind of push through those trenches if they are there. If they have then breached, then we go back again to the regular procedure. And again, you roll. High die is going to win. There is no big push when we attack trenches. There would be, however, moving forward. So trenches are breached, but First Army was spent. They're going to continue the attack. Germans win. So the French have to be turned to spent, and then that also spends this German. And there's one more that could attack with a +1, and so they would roll, and that's a 4 to a 5. The French hold out. That means he's spent, and they would have no more armies in that area, so they could not continue the attack. So the attack would effectively be over. That would go away. What would happen afterwards? Trenches then return, and then all these units are spent. So that's how trenches work in combat. Let's do something a little bit different here, however. Let's go flip some of these guys back to their original spots. Let's say this trench doesn't exist, and we're in a situation that's just like this. And this French army was attacking into here. Because there are mountains, the defender gets a automatic +1. So in this situation, if the French was attacking into the Rhine, they would roll. They're at a 5, but the defender gets a +1. That's a 5. It's still a win for the attacker. But say it was a 5 to a 5, this actually would be modified into a 6 because the defender is in a mountainous area, which gives them a +1 defense, +1 roll to their attack. So that's a +1 DRM. Anywhere where there are mountain areas, the mountains actually provide that defense. So that's the real terrain to notice. It's all printed on the key, but it's also right on each individual area. So that's some of the basic combats. Let's talk through some of the other unique things in combat. So artillery. Let's say that we have an artillery marker, which we have right here. What those would allow to do, and let's say the trench has already been breached. The artillery marker can be used during an attack. It is flipped to fired, and it goes at the attack. What it allows is it allows a extra die to be rolled. Now the die, you're still taking the high value, but what you're doing is you're taking the single highest value. So what we would do is we'd roll, there's 6. Let's say we rolled a 6 and a 1. Because we use the artillery, we'd be able to take the 6 and ignore the 1. If you have a level 2 artillery through your technology, and you get your A2 technology, you actually can roll up to 3 dice in combat. So again, same thing. It would just be 3 dice, and we got a 1, a 5, and a 6. So we'd be able to then ignore the 1 and the 5, and we'd use the 6 against the 5. So the artillery can be really, really important. In terms of the attacker, is softening up the area in the attack, giving you extra dice in combat if you use the artillery. Artillery can also be used in defense if you have the counter battery technology. Again, all the technologies are things that you can get in the technology decks, as we talked in the overview video. It works basically the same way. When it's flipped, just the defender gets the extra dice instead of the attacker. So that's artillery. Again, very, very simple to use. Other special combat is there are tanks that the Western Allies can get. Those are kind of like artillery. They are spent, and what they do is they immediately breach a trench. So let's remove this artillery for a second. Let's say there's a trench here. A tank marker would immediately breach the trench without having to attack it. So you're saving that fresh army from having to attack. The tanks are able to go through there. Western Allies are the only folks that have tanks in the game, and they're developed. They're like a really late war technology, so you're probably not going to get to them until very late in the game. But they can kind of be big to kind of bust through some of the trenches, especially if there are multiple trench levels. It can help kind of soften up those trenches dramatically. Other things that might come out, there could be air superiority. So if there's air superiority that's there, basically what it can do is it would save on ties. Normally ties go to the attacker. Say there was a roll, both sides roll a 1. Because there was air superiority in that area, the tie then goes to the defender. So air superiority helps in terms of defense. So that can be very big in terms of defending an area and trying to kind of hold an area if you can maintain air superiority. Let's see, there's one last extra unit, and it is the Stosstruppen, if I'm saying that right in German, or the Stormtrooper marker. And so what it allows to do is it lets the German attacker re-roll up to twice. So it can be used once, and then twice, and then it is spent. Um, and so it's on one attack, and it can just be spent to use for those purposes. And so again, very powerful if you're trying to launch and kind of bust through a line. Uh, you can maybe get a couple extra attacks with maybe not as many. It's again technology that you have to develop through the tech deck, so you're not going to have it probably till later in the game, but something that can modify combat definitely for the German player and can be really huge. Last thing I want to talk about is the they shall not pass defense. So we talked about, let's get a situation here. Let's move these off. Let's say we have this situation in Verdun. There's one defender left and he's already spent. The attacker wants to attack again, and they decide that they're going to attack. And let's say on this one, they win. Actually, let's do this a little bit differently. Let's say we have two defenders in here and they're both spent. So attacker attacks into here, they're successful. Um, Typically, they'd have to retreat, but anywhere where there is a home production or the home uh, victory flag area, the defender can choose an option that is called they shall not pass. What they do is they pick a defending army, and that army is eliminated permanently, so it cannot be rebuilt. Most armies in the game um, could be rebuilt if for some reason they're taken off the map, but here this particular army is gone for good, and there is no way the French player can get them back. And then the French player would have to make a die roll, and anything 2 or higher, it cancels the retreat. So the retreat is now canceled. Um, but in subsequent attacks, if they are attacked into that area on the next turn, and the same thing happens for every eliminated counter that they have, every eliminated army, it's a +1 to this die roll. Um, and so, or a -1 to this die roll. And so they're going to be, A, they're going to have less units that they can bring back, and B, it's going to become harder and harder to hold that ground. But it's very important, especially probably mostly for the German player, if the Western Allies can make some pushes, or the Western Ally player, if the Germans can get through, they might want to desperately hold that area. Especially if it's a home area like Paris, you may not want to give that up. That's an auto victory if you lose it, so it might be worth eliminating some armies to cancel that retreat. But very costly because, again, you're not going to be able to bring them back, for one, and for two, it's going to mean that subsequent rolls for the same thing are going to have a less likely chance of winning. If you had rolled a 1 in that situation, if the French player, then basically they are still forced to retreat. So that is an option to kind of hold that ground and make sure that you're not conceding some of those victory point areas to your opponent. But again, it comes at a pretty high cost. So something to think about there as an option. Okay, let's talk about sea movement. So sea movement are armies moved through friendly control area to another friendly control area through the sea. So essentially, this is something that is typically done by basically the United States or any of the Western allies. So essentially, this is really the main thing that the British are going to be doing. They have an army over here, for example, that they have built back in the British Isles, and they want to help get them over here to France. Basically, their movement, a sea movement, they're leaving a port space and they're going to a port space, and then they can kind of do their movement into there. So they're shipping areas over, And that's essentially what they do. They move through the sea area when they're moving to a friendly controlled area, from a friendly controlled area to another friendly controlled area. So sea movements, Western Allies, only one movement per turn. So of the two units that they move, only one of them can be a sea movement, right? So if the British have two armies over here, they could not ship both of them over in the same turn. They could ship one, and then another unit that's already out here could move, but they could not ship two. That's a restriction that they have in terms of the shipping. So that's essentially how sea movement works. Again, you're leaving a friendly controlled area to another friendly controlled area, and you're using the ports to be able to get there. So friendly to friendly. That's a sea move. The other interesting thing that can happen is amphibious invasions. And so there is some amphibious rules in here. This is like one of the edge cases. Normally, you can't have uh, armies of different sides in the same space. However, the amphibious movement kind of breaks that a little bit and does things a little bit differently. Okay, so let's talk through amphibious invasions because they're a little bit interesting. Let's say the British want to start by assaulting Gallipoli. They can move at most um, one army. They have the amphibious invasion. They are going to launch it against Gallipoli, and so they bring their army over here. If the area that they are invading has no defender, no defending army, just like the other spaces, there is an implied uh, garrison, only it has a fixed die roll of 4. So again, one of the higher defense garrisons, the highest defense that could be. So essentially, the British player here would have to roll a 4 or higher to be successful. So let's say that they roll, and oops, it's a they don't the defender doesn't roll here. So they roll a 5. They would then be spent, and they would be able to move in and take the area. Let's say, however, that they roll a 1. 1 is less than 4. They are not destroyed outright, but they don't advance. What ends up happening, however, is a beachhead is formed, and the unit does not retreat. So one of the few times that you're going to have armies of opposing forces in the same area is when there's a amphibious invasion. While there is a beachhead, on the subsequent turn, the British could ship another unit in, and the beachhead has a capacity of 2 armies. So it could be a max of 2 armies at their at any given time. Other things to note is that regardless of technology, the British can only ever roll 1 die. They can get a second die, but they have to take one of their active fleets and flip it to spent, basically signifying that the Navy is sent down to assist in the invasion and using some bombardment to go along with that. So they can roll at most 2. Say there was an actual defending army here instead of a garrison, something like this. Um, the defender can roll 1 extra dice. And so let's say they roll, and it's going to be 2 dice versus 2 here. In this case, again, the defender would be successful here, or the attacker would be successful, but they weren't able to get ahead in any game. So again, they're going to sit on the beachhead, and they're not going to be able to get in. If there was a second one, so say in a subsequent turn, again, the British player was able to bring a second army down. They could then, like a normal attack, roll again, and say they were spending the fleet, and they rolled again. You're going to go 5 to 5. Attacker is going to win on that one, and then they would be able to take foothold in. If there was a situation where, say, say we get something like this, we have a 5 and a 4 on the defense. and the attacker, say they roll snake eyes, they roll double one. Because both of the defender dies were higher than both of the attacker dies, the army, instead of going on the beachhead, is destroyed outright. So it basically cancels the entire amphibious assault. There is no beachhead that is formed, and they kind of have to retreat and go away. So it is a permanent destroy. So much like a Thou Shalt Not Pass, that army is destroyed and will not be able to be rebuilt. So again, can be a very costly determination. Amphibious invasions carry a lot of risk, but there is potential that you can get a foothold somewhere, especially for the British. Out here and getting Gallipoli is important because they can then ship in to Russia. They can send production points in and get in here. So they have to hold Gallipoli and Anatolia, which is printed here on the map, to be able to use these ports uh, on the inside. So that could be very big for them. They might want to get in and supply Romania and keep them in the fight at some point. Um, so amphibious assault's really the only main way that they're going to be able to do that, unless they get a lot of attacks coming out of here in the Near East and are able to kind of make their way through Turkey that direction, which would be pretty tough to do. Um, so yeah, that is basically how amphibious assaults work. Probably not something you want to do a lot, but could be very beneficial for especially for the Western Ally player, to be able to get a foothold somewhere. There are some interesting rules. If Belgium is conquered and the Germans keep at least one fresh army there, um, there is no amphibious assault into Belgium. It's a little edge case rule that basically shows that a bunch of U-boat factories were kind of built pretty quickly after Belgium fell, and so the Germans kind of had a good feel for what was going off the coast of Belgium, and so there was no real way that an amphibious assault was ever going to happen there. Um, so that's a way for Germany, if they get Belgium, they don't have to leave a whole bunch of units behind, worrying that there might be a D-Day of sorts happening in World War One, because that's a rule in there that it can't happen. Last thing I didn't really discuss a lot was naval retreats. Say there was something like this, and the Turkish player was able to attack into Gallipoli, um, and the British player was spent, and the Turkish player wins that combat. Great Britain can do a naval retreat using the port. However, the army is eliminated. They don't go back anywhere, but not permanently. It's one of the few times if an army is eliminated through a naval invasion, they can be rebuilt. So that is the kind of the last thing that we didn't talk about in terms of Navy, but the Western Allies can do naval evacuations for retreats if they're at areas with ports, and those ports then allow them to retreat the army. It still is eliminated, however, it can be rebuilt. And so that pretty much takes us through all of the different movement and different combat um, that could happen in the game in terms of your regular standard land combat, and all of the different variations that you have. You've got your basic combat. You got basic combat with your big push if the attacker wins. You've got mountains giving you a DRM of 1. You've got garrisons and spaces that don't have anybody in them. And then you've got all the use of artillery, tanks, and the defensive bonus of trenches that happen. So again, there's a lot there to unpack, but each one of those is pretty simple. The rules are very clear in how that happens, and it's a very easy way to kind of roll through combat. Really, the longest piece of the combat is if you have a large stack of units going up against another large stack of units. you might have to have 6, 7, 8 head-to-head die rolls with your opponent to kind of resolve one particular attack. And you might want to launch 3 or 4 attacks in your particular turn. So if you have a lot of big armies squaring up against a lot of other big armies, it could just make the combat last a little longer, which I think kind of drags out the game a little bit, but is very attritional feel for World War One. And again, very, very simple. You don't have to worry about a ton of DRMs. It's basically high die wins, so that you can explain that pretty easily. And it keeps you kind of focused out of the rule book and more on the action and more on the strategy of what's going on. So that is how movement and combat works for the lamps are going out. And next, we'll kind of talk through some of the production phases and how production works. So thank you.